Hello and welcome to this presentation on blood pressure. What I will try to do in the next 35 minutes or so is to summarize the most interesting, the most important, the most salient points from a review of the research on the impact of dietary factors on blood pressure. As you know, elevated blood pressure represents a significant increase in the risk of getting a heart attack or stroke. Normal blood pressure, of course, is considered to be 120/80. However, there are data to suggest that risk reduction continues down to as low as 110/70 or less, assuming, of course, that that level is achieved without medication. So a blood pressure of 138/88 increases risk 5 times compared to one of 110/70, all things being equal, of course. And for every 1 point reduction in blood pressure, there's about a 1% reduction in risk. Now, generally, hypertension is diagnosed by taking multiple measurements at different times, at different days. A single measurement, such as taken in a doctor's office, isn't always the most accurate, nor is it the most reliable way to assess if someone is hypertensive or not. This was a study commissioned by the Bill Gates Foundation. It involved 500 researchers from all over the world, and when they looked at things that we do to ourselves or biometric factors that increase our risk, blood pressure came out on top and is the leading cause of death and disability in Western countries. So this is something that we really need to pay attention to. Associated problems for elevated blood pressure include increased risk for things like aneurysms, heart attack, kidney failure, stroke. It damages our vessels and arteries, and so it affects multiple organ systems, primarily, of course, the cardiovascular system. And similar to other biometrics, the worse the blood pressure, the higher the blood pressure, the greater the risk for premature death and end organ problems. So this has implications for evaluating the risk versus benefits of taking medications, which I will discuss at the end. A term you might have heard of is pulse pressure. This is the difference between the systolic and diastolic pressures. So why is this important? Well, as people get older, especially in Western countries, the arteries tend to stiffen and they lose their elasticity. A healthy artery should be able to expand and contract when necessary. So if someone has a blood pressure of, say, 140/70, this represents a large pulse pressure. This is also known as isolated hypertension and can be indicative of problems and risk as well. Now, when trying to lower blood pressure, the recommendation is often made to reduce salt intake. Now, reducing sodium and salt intake is not in the best interest of the food industry, so they've often tried to muddy the waters to suggest that, well, maybe salt's not as bad for blood pressure as we've been led to believe. So let's take a look at some research. In this study, they put hypertensive patients on a low-salt diet, and their blood pressure did indeed go down. Then they gave them a placebo or a salt pill in a double-blind manner. On the placebo pill, blood pressure stayed low. On the salt pill, it went back up, and this was dose dependent, so the more salt that they ingested, the higher the blood pressure climbed. Even a single meal high in salt can raise blood pressure. If you give subjects a bowl of soup with lots of salt, blood pressure will go up over the next 3 hours compared to the same soup with no salt added. But what if you have normal blood pressure? Well, even if you are normotensive, you can benefit from reducing your salt intake. And when we do this, this has been shown to improve something called endothelial function. So our arteries and vessels are lined with cells called endothelial cells. These release something called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a potent vasodilator. It keeps our arteries healthy. And so here they recommend trying to get our salt intake to below 3 grams a day, as that will help improve endothelial function. This was a report and meta-analysis by the Cochrane Group on the impact of salt and blood pressure. By the way, this group is not funded by agribusiness or big pharma, and they're known to be relatively unbiased, so when they report on something, I usually pay attention. These were some of their conclusions. Again, the effect of high salt diet will result in an increase in blood pressure as we get older. Reducing our salt intake has a dose response. So in other words, the more we reduce the salt, the more likely the systolic blood pressure will go down. And reductions from an average of 9 to 12 grams a day, even if you cut that in half to 5 to 6 grams a day, will have significant benefit, especially at the population level. However, this is still not ideal, and they also recommend trying to get that to below 3 grams a day. And incidentally, 3 grams of salt a day is about 1.3 teaspoons. And that still has about 2,900 milligrams of sodium, which I think for some people is still a little bit on the high side. At any rate, reductions in salt have been shown to benefit both hypertensive and normotensive individuals, as we talked about. It benefits both men and women. It benefits whites and African Americans. However, the greatest benefits are seen in African Americans and those with elevated blood pressure to begin with. So potassium, on the other hand, has the opposite effect of salt. It helps to relax stiffened arteries because it promotes nitric oxide release. And consuming a potassium-rich diet has been shown to reduce our risk for stroke and cardiovascular disease in long-term prospective studies. Notice it's important to eat potassium-rich foods, not to get it through supplements. Now, the bad news is that vast majority of people in the US and probably other Western countries as well eat a diet that's deficient in potassium. The general recommendation is to get about 4,000 milligrams a day, and most people, again, get less than half of that. So when you think of potassium-rich foods, what foods come to mind? Well, if you guess bananas, you would be wrong. In fact, bananas rank pretty low as a good source of potassium. If you guessed plant foods, you would be correct, but in particular foods like beans and greens and potatoes with their skins, avocados, other foods like nuts, seeds, dates, and dried apricots are also good sources as well. So you can see when you eat a lot of these foods, it's pretty easy to get that to that 4,000 milligrams a day. But back to salt and sodium. Here we have some foods that are high in sodium, but which of these foods is the highest? Well, if you guessed fries and pretzels, you'd be wrong because it actually is the chicken. Why is this? Well, the good news is that some manufacturers are trying to reduce the salt content of their foods, but other manufacturers are actually increasing the salt levels. For example, the addition of salt to poultry, meats, and fish appears to be occurring on a massive scale. Why do they do this? Well, adding salt to meat pulls in water, which increases weight. Meat is sold by weight, and so this then increases profits. And by the way, it's then legal to label the product as natural because, after all, salt is natural. Here's a list of other high sodium foods. So we get most of our sodium from things like meats, cheeses, pizza, processed meats, fast food, canned foods, and processed foods. About 5% is added during cooking, about 6% is added at the table, and 12% is found naturally in food. So even if you ate a completely salt-free diet, you'd still be getting plenty of sodium. In fact, you'd probably be getting about the right amount. If you eat a turkey sandwich for lunch, which some people might consider this to be healthy, well, you're already getting over 1,500 milligrams of sodium without even using a salt shaker. And again, most of that sodium is coming from the cheese and the meat, a little bit from the bread. Trust me when I say it's not coming from the lettuce. So we know that sodium can stiffen our arteries, but how does it do that? What's the mechanism? So this was the information that really got to me because my blood pressure is actually quite low, not to brag, but it is below 100/70 most of the time. So I didn't really pay much attention to how much salt I was eating. I figured I had carte blanche when it came to eating salty foods. Well, not so fast. So what sodium does is interfere with a powerful antioxidant called superoxide dismutase. Superoxide dismutase is produced in our mitochondria, and it protects us against oxidative stress and oxidative damage. Oxidative stress is not good for arterial function. So salt can interfere with superoxide dismutase even when blood pressures are low, such as someone like myself. So also as an athlete, I want to keep my arteries in pristine condition. So I'm trying to change my ways. But just cutting back on salt isn't going to do the trick 100%. there are other dietary factors that play a role independent of salt intake and are just as important, if not more important, I think, to pay attention to. So one of these factors is the role of inflammation. So it's been hypothesized that low-grade chronic inflammation can promote and increase blood pressure. So this paper was a review paper, and it looked at the studies looking at this question of inflammation and hypertension. So we've known for some time that chronic low-grade inflammation is an integral part of the pathogenesis of vascular disease, and this is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease and mortality. So there are data to suggest that elevated high-sensitive CRP, a marker of inflammation, is predictive for the development of hypertension in normotensive patients. What CRP does, it downregulates, again, that production of that very important nitric oxide. So this is a little bit of a vicious cycle, because when you have damage to the endothelial function, this can lead to hypertension, and then hypertension in turn can negatively alter and damage endothelial function. But all in all, they sort of concluded that inflammation can lead to increased arterial stiffness and thus increased blood pressure. So what foods might promote inflammation? This was a study out of the UK. They looked at 27 foodstuffs common to the Western diet and the capacity of each to induce inflammation and to increase markers of inflammation like tumor necrosis factor, for example. What they found, of all the foods they tested, the worst foods were pork, poultry, and ice cream, unfortunately. So what these foods provide are whopping doses of something called bacterial endotoxins, and these endotoxins is what stimulates that increased inflammation. Endotoxins are bits of bacteria. They're just part of the meat and dairy package. So a hamburger, for example, has been shown to contain approximately 100 million bacteria. Now, it's important to note that this ability to induce this inflammatory response is retained even after you cook the meat. If you expose it to an acid bath, expose it to digestive enzymes, it just doesn't seem to matter. As it turns out, animal fat may also play a profound role by increasing the absorption of these endotoxins. So endotoxins have a strong affinity for the saturated fat transport system through the gut wall and into the bloodstream. So animal fat may also play a role in boosting our absorption of these endotoxins. So when you eat a hamburger, it's sort of a double whammy, because it's also high in saturated fat as well as these bacteria. So this led the researchers to say, and I quote, "The occasional ingestion of meals high in bacterial endotoxins could promote transient mild systemic inflammatory episodes that predispose subjects to the development of atherosclerosis, as well as, interestingly enough, insulin resistance." So what foods are anti-inflammatory? Well, whole plant foods have very potent anti-inflammatory effects. So we think that might be one mechanism as to why plant-based diets tend to reduce our risk for cardiovascular diseases as well as certain cancers. So if you want to reduce your inflammation, eat your vegetables, your fruits, beans, nuts, whole grains, and so on. Now, some of the most interesting research on inflammation has been on the essential fatty acids, omega-3s and omega-6s. So essential means we need to get these from our diet. We have no nutritional need for other fats like saturated fat or cholesterol. So in Western diets, omega-6 comes primarily from vegetable oils, and so is thus quite prevalent. Omega-6 fatty acids are converted into arachidonic acid, which is then converted into these pro-inflammatory eicosanoids. Incidentally, preformed arachidonic acid is found in animal foods. Now, omega-3 fatty acids, on the other hand, there's three types of omega-3 fatty acids. There's the short-chain alpha-linoleic acid, and these get converted into the long-chain fatty acids, EPA and DHA, which in turn then get converted into these anti-inflammatory eicosanoids. So all animals, fish included, need to get omega-3 fats from their food. Fish get it from algae and sea vegetable. Land animals get it from leafy greens and nuts and seeds. And we're pretty good at converting ALA into DHA and EPA so we can have adequate intakes of omega-3s without having to eat fish. However, there is a small percentage of people, this is more common in men, that aren't really good at converting ALA into EPA and DHA. So it's probably advisable for some people to actually take a DHA and EPA supplement, preferably though from algae-derived sources, not from fish oil. So fish oil is notoriously high in contaminants. It's impossible to remove the contaminants that get concentrated in the fatty tissue of fish. So algae-derived EPA supplement is a much safer supplement. So of concern is that changes to our diets over the last 100 years have resulted in a dramatic change in the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 in circulation and in our tissues. So we think that the ideal ratio is closer to 4-to-1 or 3-to-1. Now, we sort of need a balance, right? We need some inflammation that helps with stimulate healing processes, but we also need to have that balance with anti-inflammatory processes. One study where they got people to reduce this ratio, get it closer to the 4-to-1 when they ate this way for 4 weeks. This resulted in actual changes in gene expression of these cytokines and resulted in a more anti-inflammatory state. So, the goal is to increase our intake of nuts and seeds and definitely try to reduce our consumption of vegetable oils as well. But as we mentioned, arachidonic acid is also a key substrate for the synthesis of these pro-inflammatory eicosanoids. So which foods are highest in arachidonic acid? So things like chicken, eggs, beef, sausage, and fish, very high. So this, in addition to the bacterial endotoxins that are prevalent in these foods, could be another reason why these foods promote inflammation. Another source of inflammation are AGEs, or advanced glycation end products. These are formed when we cook high-protein foods at high temperatures and in particular dry temperatures. So AGE is an apt acronym because they have been implicated in accelerating the aging process. So for example, they could promote skin wrinkling, but more importantly, they've been implicated in autoimmune diseases. They've been implicated in playing a causative role in Alzheimer's and dementia, as well as contributing to joint problems, as well as atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. So what these AGEs do, they're potent amplifiers of inflammation, and they also promote oxidative stress. So what foods are highest in AGEs? Well, I sort of gave you a clue: high protein foods, high temperatures. So this was a paper that looked at hundreds of different foods, and these were the foods that had the highest of these AGEs. So things like roasted chicken, fried steak, broiled, barbecued, and so on. Starchy foods, on the other hand, and foods that have a high water content are quite low in these AGEs. Fruits and vegetables, of course, contain almost none. All right, so far I've sort of ragged a lot on meat, especially when it comes to its ability to promote inflammation, but does eating meat then actually translate into increasing blood pressure? So let's take a look at some of the research. All right, so in Western countries, as people get older, their blood pressures go up, and it's actually pretty rare to find people over the age of 65 who have normal blood pressures and who are not on medication. However, this doesn't happen in all countries. So this was an interesting study out of Kenya. And what they did was they compared Kenyans to age-matched Europeans in the US. So here we see at younger ages, blood pressures are about the same, a relatively normal 120/80. However, after the age of 60, the Kenyans' blood pressure actually got lower, whereas those in the US, it reached hypertensive levels. Even more interesting, though, was over 2 years at a native hospital where they looked at over 1,800 patients, there was not a single case of blood pressure encountered. Not only were there no cases of high blood pressure, there were also no cases of heart disease or atherosclerosis. So what were these people eating? Well, their traditional diet was based on whole grains, beans, vegetables, fruits, and greens. Our study was observational in nature. So let's look at some prospective studies where we follow people over time. One of the better studies out there, I think, is the Adventist Health Study. So this is an ongoing study that represents something of a natural experiment. And what that means is that in this population, there are just naturally few confounders. So for example, they tend to have very similar lifestyles in the sense they don't smoke, they don't drink caffeine, a lot of caffeine, they don't tend to drink a lot of alcohol, they have very strong social support systems, they're encouraged to exercise. However, about half of them are vegetarians, so there's some variation in terms of how much animal foods they consume. And even those who do eat meat do so sparingly, and they don't eat certain meats like pork. So in this first study, when they compared the vegetarians to the non-vegetarians, those that were vegetarian had over a 50% reduced risk of developing hypertension. In the second study, they broke it out by the degree to which people ate animal foods, and as they consumed fewer animal foods, the risk for hypertension continued to go down. So those that were 100% plant-based had over a 75% reduced risk compared to those who ate some meat. And notice that this reduction in risk was similar for diabetes. But what happens if you take vegetarians and feed them some meat? So in this study, they took college students, they added some meat to their diet, and found that their blood pressure went up in as little as 11 days, and then blood pressure went back down after they stopped eating meat. Well, there's been a number of other studies that have reported this. When you put people on a vegetarian diet, their blood pressure tends to go down, and then it goes back up when meat is reintroduced. This was the InterMAP study, a very well-known study, and again they found that as vegetable protein intake went up, blood pressure tended to be lower. In the Western Electric study, when people ate more animal protein and fat, the higher their risk was for hypertension. For plant proteins had the opposite effect. And in a very famous, well-known EPIC study, in this case the Oxford EPIC study, a study that's going on in Europe and the UK, so they found that even unhealthy vegetarians still had significantly lower rates of hypertension compared to the relatively healthy meat eaters. And so how do we know the vegetarians weren't that healthy? Well, when we looked at their fiber intake was actually quite low, which would suggest they were eating a lot of processed foods. So we don't recommend that either. But so in addition to the pro-inflammatory effects of meat and the fact that it comes with a lot of sodium, what else could perhaps account for this very strong association that we see between animal consumption and elevated blood pressure? Well, part of the explanation could be the types of amino acids that are found in plant proteins versus animal proteins. So they have very different amino acid makeups. So one amino acid which is low in animal foods and high in plant foods is glutamic acid. And so they've studied this and found that as glutamic acid goes up, blood pressure tends to go down after controlling for other confounders. So what glutamic acid does, it actually promotes the production of something called glutathione. And glutathione is an antioxidant that we make, similar to superoxide dismutase. And so it helps to quench oxidative stress. And glutamic acid also enhances the hypotensive effects of nitric oxide. Another amino acid that is low in animal proteins but high in things like beans and seeds and nuts is arginine. And arginine is the precursor to that all-important nitric oxide. It's the raw material from which nitric oxide is made. So this, again, could be another explanation for this association that we tend to see. All right, so this paper also had some other recommendations for lowering blood pressure. Of course, losing some weight can be helpful, reducing salt intake, increasing potassium, as we talked about, reducing your alcohol intake, not smoking, of course. And then they recommend eating a DASH diet. So the DASH stands for Dietary Approaches to Stopping Hypertension. This is sort of a quasi-vegetarian diet. It contains some animal foods. Now, the author of this diet was a guy by the name of Frank Sachs. And Frank Sachs was very familiar, very aware of this strong association of increased animal protein to worsening blood pressure. So why doesn't the diet then advocate for or promote more of a 100% plant-based diet? Well, I think what they tried to do was sort of include the blood pressure lowering effects or benefits of a vegetarian diet while still making it palatable to non-vegetarians. Personally, I think people should at least be informed of the blood pressure lowering effects of eating plant proteins versus animal proteins, so that they can then make a choice as to how plant-based they want to be. All right, so are there specific foods which perhaps are more helpful or better at lowering blood pressure? Well, one of these foods are beans. There's a lot of important health reasons to eat more beans, one of which, of course, is that they can have blood pressure lowering effects. So they, in this review and meta-analysis of 8 isocaloric dietary intervention trials, they got participants to eat more beans, and this in turn helped to lower their blood pressure, and the reductions in blood pressure, incidentally, were greater than those observed for the DASH diet. So we think this occurs through several mechanisms, one of which is beans are high in fiber, it's high in plant protein, it's high in potassium, and all of which confer lower blood pressure lowering effects, which we talked about. It's actually recommended that we eat about 1 to 2 cups of beans a day. That's a lot of beans, but beans are cool. Another good habit is to eat a handful of walnuts a day. In this study, they put people under duress, like making them give a speech, putting their hands in cold water, and those who ate walnuts had significantly lower blood pressures during stress than those in the control group. Personally, I add walnuts to my morning smoothie. I try to eat a handful a day. It's also been shown to help with brain health as well. So lots of good reasons to eat more walnuts. But even better are flax seeds. So eating a tablespoon of ground flax a day is good for lots of reasons, but especially with helping with reducing blood pressure. So in this study, they got subjects to eat flax every day for 6 months and found an average drop in 10 points in their blood pressure. And for those who had high blood pressure to begin with, those with the highest blood pressures had an even bigger drop of 15 points. So these drops are actually pretty significant. Most intervention trials show drops at 5, maybe 3 points. So this could be one reason why the title reads Potent Antihypertensive Action of Dietary Flaxseed. And of course, flax has other benefits as well, like reducing risk for breast cancer. In this study, they had subjects drink 2 cups of hibiscus tea a day, and this was shown to be as effective at lowering blood pressure as a leading blood pressure drug. And the advantage, of course, of drinking tea is that there's no side effects. Other foods shown to be helpful in lowering blood pressure are foods that are high in nitrates. So nitrates, this is different than the nitrates found in processed meats. Okay, so those in processed meats are converted into nitrosamines, which is the same carcinogen found in cigarette smoke. This could be why the World Cancer Research Fund recommends that humans not consume processed meat for the rest of their lives. Their words, not mine. All right, so nitrate-rich foods, plant foods, which are rich in nitrates, help to produce our production of that all-important nitric oxide. Incidentally, consumption of nitrate-rich foods has also been shown to boost athletic performance, help with altitude adaptation, as well as boost mental performance. And so this article concluded we advocate the consumption of a diet high in nitrates as a natural strategy to treat hypertension. Well, what foods are highest in nitrates? Well, leafy greens win the day. Beet greens, basil, butter lettuce, cilantro, arugula is the highest. Although beet juice has been getting most of the glory, it could be that drinking a glass of beet juice just helps. It's easier to get a big dose that way. My recommendation is to drink beet juice, eat beets, and lots of leafy greens. I actually try to eat greens three times a day. I put it in my morning smoothie, in addition to having salads for lunch and dinner. But I also drink beet juice. This is my preferred product. I buy it. You can buy it on Amazon. To me, it tastes the most palatable compared to some of the other beet juices that I tried. All right, so sometimes blood pressure can be stubborn. It can be quite resistant to some of these lifestyle changes. So the exact timetable for recovery through lifestyle interventions can be difficult to predict. So for example, Dr. Furman reported that it took a year for one of his patients to discontinue all of her medications in spite of the fact that she changed her diet to a plant-based, nutrient-rich diet. She had very rapid weight loss in the first few months, and yet it took a year. So sometimes reversing years of unhealthy eating can take some time. Now, there is something, though, that can sort of jumpstart that process, and it's sort of like hitting the reset button, and that is water fasting. So this was a study from the True North Health Center in California. Patients underwent a supervised water fast for a number of days. This was followed by a refeeding period of fruits and vegetable juices, and then by eating an unprocessed plant-based diet that was low in salt and sugar and oil. And the reductions in blood pressure continued as long as patients ate a health-promoting diet. Now, as you can see, the reductions in blood pressure following the period of fasting were dramatic. So for those that had severe hypertension, average drop was 60 points. Those that had mild hypertension, average drop was 30 points. I mean, this is nothing short of remarkable. And what's even more remarkable is that they also went off their medications during this time period. And this was achieved in a relatively short period of time. And the reductions were maintained, like I said, once they started eating again. So I think that this program is in fact covered by some insurance companies. So for some people, if you're doing all the right things and the blood pressure is still not going down, this might be something to consider. Of course, the other benefit of doing a water fast is that it also resets your tastes. If you go off food for a period of time, healthy food starts to taste good once you start eating again. All right, so just in closing, I want to just touch on blood pressure medications. So there's a number of different classes of blood pressure lowering medications on the market. They all come with a host of side effects. Some are less dangerous or less risky than others, but other than increased risk of dying, kidney damage, fatigue, dizziness, muscle weakness, headaches, and so on, I guess these drugs are pretty good. So, but when on the whole, when you look at their ability to reduce overall mortality, the benefits are actually somewhat minimal. Now, one way to sort of assess the risk versus benefits of taking medications was this chart by Dr. Welsh. He wrote the book called Overdiagnosed. It's a really interesting, brilliant book, I think. So as we mentioned, the risks of high blood pressure goes up the higher the blood pressure is, but the line for the adverse effects of drugs is actually pretty flat. Okay. So at more mild levels of hypertension, it could be that the risks of taking medication outweigh any possible benefits. And I know doctors are pretty quick to pull out that prescription pad. But at very severe levels of hypertension, the benefits of these medications probably outweigh the risks. So my recommendation, of course, is to change your diet, lose weight, start to exercise, quit smoking if you smoke. And if you make these changes and you're on meds, you should monitor your intake and try to get that dose as low as possible to mitigate those risks and hopefully even at some point discontinue your medication altogether. Well, that's all I have. These are some really good resources, nutritionfacts.org. You can search blood pressure and come up. He goes into a lot more depth into some of these studies that I touched on. And then healthpromoting.com, that's the True North Health Center, where they do the supervised water fasting, if that's something you're interested in. All right, so thanks for listening, and that's a wrap.